Hey everybody, it is Nathan Selove with another edition of Autism Actually Speaking. So today I want to talk about a topic that's not just relevant to the autism and disabled community, but it's also relevant to other marginalized community as well. And I'm going to be approaching this topic from both an advocacy perspective and an academic perspective. Microaggressions. So today I want to discuss what microaggressions are, why they can be a problem, and some ways that we can be more conscientious and impeccable with our words. So what is a microaggression? Well, you've probably heard that word thrown around on Twitter a lot, which, side note, I just recently got a Twitter, so if you have a Twitter, you should totally follow me, @NathanSelove. A microaggression is a statement, often unintentional, which denigrates a marginalized community or creates the implication of the inferiority of that marginalized community. Oftentimes, the person who commits the microaggression legitimately believes that they're just giving the person a compliment. For example, when a neurotypical tells an autistic, "Wow, you don't look autistic." Now, at face value, you might look at that statement and think, well, I don't see what the problem is. I mean, disability is a bad thing. We're saying that you don't look like you have a disability, which we've already established is a bad thing. So if you don't look like a bad thing, then what's the problem here? Now, the problem with that particular statement is threefold. Number one, it implies that being disabled is inherently a bad thing. Number two, it implies that being neurotypical is the neutral state of humanity, and thus anything that deviates from that is less human. And number three, it delegitimizes the struggle that people on the autism spectrum go through. We have sensory problems. We have problems fitting in oftentimes. And when someone just brushes all that aside with a "you don't look autistic," it can feel hurtful. So now you might hear that and you might think, well, you're reading quite a lot from that, and I understand that that could be frustrating, but is it really that much of a problem? It's clearly unintentionally offensive, so when you hear that, can't you just brush it aside? And that brings us to why microaggressions are a problem. If it was just one person that came up to me after I told them that I was autistic and were like, "Oh, well, you don't look autistic," that would be pretty easy to just brush aside. However, the problem with microaggressions is not the individual times in which they happen, it's the accumulation of how many times they happen. So let me lay out a narrative for you. When I was a kid, I had a lot of trouble with making friends. And I also had a lot of trouble with sensory, which my problems with sensory still persist to this day. I felt like an outsider, an alien to people around me. And on top of that, whenever I would hear a really loud noise, I would freak out. Many days, I would just spend looking at the clock, waiting for the time to run out so I could go home and not be around people anymore. Not because I didn't want to interact with them, but because I knew that they didn't want to interact with me. Now, with that background, imagine me talking to a peer in high school and revealing to them that I'm autistic for the first time, and then them saying, well, you don't look autistic. Well, seems like a curious statement. Seems pretty harmless. Now imagine I go to my next class and I reveal to my teacher for the first time that I'm autistic, and they're like, "Wow, I would have never known." Now imagine then I go to the school library and I check out some books on autism, and while I'm checking them out, the librarian is like, "Oh, you interested in autism?" And I say, "Yeah, I actually am autistic." And then the librarian says, I wouldn't have guessed." Now take all of that and multiply it by 15 years of having my autism diagnosis and telling people that I'm autistic. Eventually, it just wears you down. You might get to the point where you don't even want to tell people you're autistic. You don't want to interact with new people because you just don't want to deal with that question. And now imagine trying to explain to somebody why you hate it when people say you don't look autistic, and then them just being like, "Well, I feel like you're making microaggressions into macroaggressions." I mean, think of it this way. If you stub your toe on a couch once, it'll hurt. It'll suck. But you know that in like a few minutes, your toe's probably going to feel fine. But what if you then stub it again the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and every single day for your entire life? Eventually, you're gonna want to stay away from the couch. You're gonna be afraid of the couch. You're gonna want to completely stay out of the living room. And it's probably going to cause some permanent damage to your toe. And then when people ask you why you're in pain and you say, "Oh, I stubbed my toe," they're just like, "Okay, that doesn't seem like a big deal." So when someone who is in a marginalized community gets pissed off about a microaggression, they're not necessarily pissed off at you. They're pissed off at the accumulation of all of the people that have made it over and over and over again. So how do we solve this? Well, I'm definitely not an advocate for responding to microaggressions with macroaggressions. But we as a collective really need to educate ourselves on the cultures of other marginalized communities. Understand the historical context of that group. Take some time studying the interactions in that group. And the biggest way you can be conscientious is to remind yourself that who you are might seem normal to you. It might seem like the natural state of being and humanity. But it's not that way for everybody. So you shouldn't judge the level of a person's humanity based on how much they look like you or act like you. We're all humans. None of us have a monopoly on that. And it's also important to note that autistics are definitely not immune to committing microaggressions. In fact, since a lot of us have trouble following certain social cues, it happens quite a bit. So I hope that the autistics watching this that are in my audience can also take some of these principles that you probably relate to and understand and apply them to being empathetic towards other marginalized communities as well. So the next time you accidentally commit a microaggression and the person gets pissed at you or annoyed with you, try to take a second and see it from their point of view. Understand that it's not that one act that you just committed that is behind their ire. It's the accumulation. So spend some time actually trying to understand why what you said might have evoked a reaction. And then just try to be conscientious about it in the future. We all say silly things, we all say stupid things, and we all offend each other. What's important is that we learn from it. We recognize where those biases come from so that we can do what we can to prevent them in the future. Well, that's today's video. Thank you all for watching. If you liked this video, please give it a like, a share, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel, check out some of my other stuff, and I am now on Twitter, so you should follow me, @NathanSelove. And if you want to support the channel in other ways, support me on Patreon. And remember, if you had to re-record your outro several times because you were thrown off by the addition of your Twitter in your outro, you might be autistic.